From KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Rising Up with Sonali, and I'm your host, Sonali Kolhatkar. You can watch this show on Free Speech TV and listen to it on Pacifica radio stations and affiliates nationwide. The Muslim world has experienced much violence for decades now, with internecine warfare fueled by foreign interference. In countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and more, conflicts between Sunni and Shia groups in particular draw media attention and spur foreign analysts to make the case that sectarian wars are the primary cause of violence. It is a comfortable trope that builds on a history of Orientalism that the, quote, uncivilized masses of Muslims simply cannot get along with one another because of an ancient division among the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, dividing people and communities today. At present, this conflict appears to manifest in various ways: the Sunni-Shia battles in Iraq and Syria, and the Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia in a proxy war against Shia-dominated Iran, etc. But it is crucial to understand the true nature of the battles being fought, especially given the United States' long-standing role in arming and backing one side against another. My guest is Nader Hashemi. He is the Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver, author of Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. And he's the editor with Danny Postel of the new book, Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. He joins me to discuss that book. Welcome to the program, Nader.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks so much for joining us. So groups like the Council on Foreign Relations here in the U.S. Very much use this idea of Sunni-Shia conflict to explain so many of the battles that are fought in countries like Iraq. Can you give us a sense, for those who are not familiar with the CFR's position, what their justification sounds like, how they make that case?
Well, they make the case in a number of ways. In many ways, it's not unique to them. It actually is reflecting broader views in American political culture with respect to the Middle East. And so one common argument is one that you've alluded to, that Sunni and Shia Muslims have been fighting since time immemorial. This has always been an enduring conflict that really has no solution. There's nothing that anyone can do about it. This is just an enduring feature of Middle Eastern and Muslim societies. That's one argument. A related argument is that sectarian conflict is very much related to the alleged inability of the Islamic world to come to terms with modernity. And this is something that is allegedly, again, rooted in certain aspects of Islamic political thought and Islam's civilizational ethos, sort of the implication being that if you introduce Muslim political values into the public sphere, you get nothing but sectarian conflict. And then the sort of related argument that you hear, that because of the alleged enduring aspect of sectarian conflict, we should support authoritarian dictators because they can keep a lid on this ugly situation. If we don't support them, then we get more sectarian conflict. And they point to, the toppling of Saddam Hussein and the removal of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And they say, see, look, when those dictators were in power, at least things were a lot better for the world and the United States in particular. And so, forget democracy, forget human rights. The only U.S. foreign policy position that, according to this view, makes sense is to support authoritarian despots.
So this is an issue that is rooted, or this framing is rooted in historical instance, and we should actually just go through what the distribution of Sunni Shia populations are before we get to the next part of our conversation. So the majority of Muslims in the Muslim world identify as Sunni, something like 80+%, and then the rest as Shia. Can you kind of map out for us where Sunnis and Shias live, and then we'll get to how better to understand these conflicts?
Yeah, that's basically correct. I mean, the generally accepted figure is that about 85% of Muslims around the world are Sunni Muslims. The rest are Shia Muslims, roughly 15%.
And how do you explain to the average American why there's this difference? What differentiates a Sunni Muslim from a Shia Muslim?
Yeah, that's a good question. Different sort of interpretations of Islamic history. Really, the origins of the initial split among Muslims after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 revolved around the question of succession. Who should lead the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad? The majority opinion took one position, and a minority group of Muslims took another position. I can go into the details if you're interested, but that's where the original split begins. And then a sort of separate sectarian theologies develop around that particular event that over time, produce a constituency of Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, of which there are differences and divisions within them. But broadly speaking, that's the origin of the dispute. It's not that different if one wants to understand, by a comparative perspective, the similarity between Protestants and Catholics, sort of common origins, common text, but different interpretations of history and questions of where political authority and religious authority is properly located. So that's the background. In terms of the geographic distribution, most of the countries in the Muslim world, 50 plus, are majority Sunni Muslim. Iran is majority Shia. Iraq is majority Shia, about 60%. Azerbaijan and Bahrain are majority Shia. And then other countries in the Muslim world have sizable Shia populations. Pakistan, Lebanon, Syria, and they're all minority populations. And other areas in and around the Gulf. Saudi Arabia has roughly a 15% Shia population. So that's the primary distribution of the Sunni Shia split.
So let's try to go through one of the major ones. One of the major issues, of course, in recent years has been the war in Iraq. The U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein after September 11th. And we have seen, in addition to the violence directly perpetrated by the United States and its troops in Iraq, there has been a tremendous amount of internecine warfare that can be viewed over broadly sectarian lines. And the thinking is that the Shia majority had been sort of oppressed by the Sunni minority, that the ruling Sunni class, once toppled from power, then became victimized by the Shia majority. How should we view the politics within Iraq in a more nuanced way?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, what you just described is partially correct, but I would add the following elements to it. The fundamental, I think, root and framing of the sectarian conflict in Iraq today has to be located in the authoritarian policies of Saddam Hussein, who was one of the most brutal dictators in the Middle East. It's wrong to describe him as you did as a sort of a Sunni ruling class. I mean, he really was running a mafia state. He came from a Sunni background, but he didn't justify his rule by pointing to Sunni theology. It was really, if anything, secular Arab Baathist nationalism that was the justifying rule. But he did draw upon, those elements of society that he thought were more loyal, and those were people from his own village. There was a lot of Shia Muslims who were part of that ruling apparatus. But that authoritarian legacy really broke and destroyed the social fabric of Iraqi society. It produced a lot of animosity, a lot of distrust. Broadly speaking, the Shia community, which is the majority, were deeply persecuted. When they tried to organize and mobilize, they were severely repressed. We know the story of the Kurds. They were subjected to chemical weapons attack in the late 1980s. And so when the United States invades and topples Saddam Hussein, Iraqi society was already deeply broken, not just because of the oppressive and extreme repression under Saddam Hussein, but also because of the extreme suffering that Iraq was subjected to as a result of UN sanctions that were placed on Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War that further destroyed, civil society and the social fabric of all Iraqis. Ironically, at that time, strengthening, Saddam Hussein's hand. So when the Americans invade in 2003 and the entire state collapses, you get, predictably, a set of collective disorientation that sets in. The Shia feel they're persecuted. They win the elections. They have the demographic numbers, and they start, ruling in a majoritarian fashion. They don't rule, unfortunately, in the way that many of us hoped they would, in a way that was much more inclusive, but they effectively alienate the 20% Sunni Iraqi population, who then start to sympathize with an emerging Al-Qaeda insurgency that emerges in the aftermath of a broken Iraq, and deliberately and explicitly tries to cultivate a sectarian war as a way of pushing out the Americans and as a way of consolidating their own control. And so this is a policy that they pursue, Al-Qaeda does, with somewhat great success. Massive attacks on Shia population centers, religious centers, trying to foment a sectarian, civil war. And the United States, took the position that, look, we want to support the strongest party in post-Saddam Iraq, and that's the Iraqi Shia. That's the figure of Nouri al-Maliki, who basically was a majoritarian, dictator, not dictator, but at least authoritarian populist leader. And that alienated, as I said, the Sunni population of Iraq, who then start to sympathize with this Sunni insurgency. And that brings us to the rise and transformation of Al-Qaeda into ISIS, where you have an ISIS contingency that emerges out of the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the rest of the story. So I think that generally is the background. I don't think you can understand sectarian conflict in Iraq today without first referencing the brutalization that Saddam Hussein subjected Iraqi society to, and then also the American intervention just shattered Iraqi society, and they really didn't press, I think, the Iraqi Shia parties to rule more inclusively, further alienating them and leading to the sectarian conflict that we're talking about.
And how have countries like the United States and their interference, their wars, deepened existing divides within Iraq that might not be so deep had the country had a different history?
Yeah, well, the United States sort of approached the situation in Iraq post 2003 with very much a neo-colonial mindset, that there are these three groups. They don't get along. We need to sort of divide up the pieces of the pie among these three groups. And there was no attempt to foster, I think, more of an Iraqi cross-sectarian, more integrated political identity, one that guaranteed would be very difficult to do after the ravages and the extreme brutality of Saddam Hussein, but I think did have prospects. So when Karl Bremer arrives on the scene, he was effectively the American viceroy in Iraq after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. He pulls together representatives from these three groups and tries to divide up the political pie along those lines. So I think that was a major mistake. The other mistake was trying to disband completely the Iraqi army, which was looking back, I think something that furthered the sectarian conflict, because there was no security force there that could provide stability, and it provided for an opening for these extremist groups, primarily Al-Qaeda, to wreak havoc. So that was a major miscalculation by the Americans. And so those, I think, are critical background developments that lead us to today.
What about Iran? Let's talk about Iran, where we said the majority of Shias, this is the most sort of Shia concentrated country in the Muslim world. And I mentioned we're seeing this sort of proxy war between Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia, Shia-dominated Iran, or that's at least the way in which it's viewed. How have Iran's sectarian politics developed?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. Officially, when the Iranian Revolution happens in 1979, and even up until today, the official position of the Islamic Republic of Iran is that they do not pursue a sectarian policy, that they are they believe in Muslim unity. They have this annual Muslim Unity Conference. The rhetoric of the regime tries to, talk about Sunni Muslim unity. Iran is very opinionated, I would argue selectively, on the question of Palestine. Majority Sunni Muslims there, no Shia involved. But practically and effectively, Iran's policies in the Middle East, in Iraq in particular are motivated by catering to and supporting Shia political parties and Shia movements and Shia groups. Those are the constituencies that, for ideological, sectarian, cultural reasons are more inclined to work with Iran as opposed to Sunni political parties. Iran basically is perceived by large parts of the Sunni Muslim world today as a sectarian power because the policies that it's pursued, particularly in Iraq after 2009, and critically in Syria, where Iran is deeply implicated in the war crimes and the atrocities that have happened in that country over the last 7 years. Iran is perceived as, pursuing a sectarian set of policies, and those policies have been, identified by its rival in the region, Saudi Arabia, and many Sunnis now, I think, rightfully view the Islamic Republic of Iran not as it would like to be viewed, as a pan-Islamic, country supporting oppressed Muslims, but as a sectarian regime pursuing the interests and favoring one sectarian group over the other. And that's effectively what the Islamic Republic has done. Just to cite one example, in order to sustain the war effort in support of Bashar al-Assad, Iran has recruited its own pan-Shia jihadi movement, if you like, recruiting poor Shia Muslims from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, offering them money, promising them citizenship, scholarship, benefits for their families.
So a Shia alternative to ISIS, or a Shia
Basically,
counter?
yeah. Exactly. And the numbers we don't know, but I would suspect the numbers were as large as ISIS, if not greater, and sent them into Syria to do basically the heavy fighting, effectively using those poor Shia fighters, young kids, as cannon fodder, while the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sort of, coordinates the war effort for Bashar al-Assad. So this is one of the, elements and aspects in terms of how Iran has pursued its own Shia-centered sectarian policy in the Middle East. Now, I would also add that their role often gets exaggerated. I think they're very guilty in Iraq in terms of supporting sectarianism, very guilty in Syria. In terms of Bahrain and in Yemen, which we often hear that, the conflict in Yemen is another allegedly, Shia-Sunni conflict rooted in Iran's intervention. I think Iran's role in Yemen is greatly exaggerated by its Saudi adversaries. I think there's a broad consensus among experts that that's the case. The problem in Yemen is fundamentally internal to Yemeni society. So, one has to, I think, be a little bit nuanced in terms of trying to assess the role of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its regional presence. I would add also the other critical factor, the obvious one that we haven't discussed, is the heavy support that Iran gives to Hezbollah, which is its major ally in the region and part of its perceived deterrence force against the possible American or Israeli attack on Iran.
My guest is Nader Hashemi, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. He's written a book called Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy Toward a Democratic Theory for Muslim Societies. But we're talking about his new book that he is the co-editor of with Danny Postel. It's called Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. We're going to keep Nader on for an extended conversation, which you can find in the premium content section of our website at risingupwithsonali.com. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can also find out more about us on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, and Vimeo.